Welcome to Feed Your Dog Facts, the internet's #1 resource for fighting pet food industry misinformation and promoting evidence-based pet care. Now, here are your hosts, Daniel Schulof and Alexis Malone.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Feed Your Dog Facts. My name is Alexis Malone. I am your host alongside Daniel Schulof. He apparently has an itch in his eye if you're watching us on video. If you're listening to the audio, he is the CEO founder of Keto Natural Pet Foods. He's also the author of the book Dogs, Dog Food, and Dogma. Highly recommend you pick up a copy if you have not done so already. You can get a free version on ketonaturalpetfoods.com. So head that way if you're looking for a PDF. Daniel, lovely to have you. Great to see you.
Always a pleasure.
We're doing things a little differently today with this episode. So I'm hoping that you can give us an intro into why it's going to be a little bit different. And of course, the topic of discussion is how to talk to your veterinarian about nutritional topics.
Yep, exactly. So usually on this show, we talk as much as we can about evidence, about stuff that exists, and where, the public's understanding of that evidence differs. We help to, from the reality, we try to explain what's there and try to highlight stuff that people haven't thought about before, or things that they maybe have thought the wrong way about, or something like that. And so that means that we do a lot of deep dives, of course. If you're a longtime listener to the show, you get it. We do lots of deep dives. What we're doing today is less based on evidence and more based on our best experiences, our tips and advice based on our subjective experience of the world around the topic of how to talk to your veterinarian about nutritional subjects. So we're talking about this because we hear about it all the time from listeners and customers of Keto Natural. In one form or another, we get this type of communication. I was talking to I had my dog in the vet. We were there for whatever reason. And for whatever reason, we got to talking about nutritional subjects. And they said something, and it is different than what I believe. I've come to believe about something, or I think they're wrong about something. And I didn't know what to say. I didn't know. I felt you feel a degree of pressure to adopt the thinking from your trusted medical provider. And you feel a degree of pressure to take action in light of that thinking. Your vet might say something to you like, I think you should switch away from this food because I'm concerned about DCM. That's something, of course, because of our litigation, we hear all the time. And so people are uncomfortable in that situation and reach out and they go, do you have any advice on sort of how to manage that? So spend some time thinking about what can be said about what feel like, to me at least, to us, best practices, but it's not based on some body of evidence we got to explain. This is just some our observations about what tends to work best. And then kind of make sure we're framing it up in a way that make sure that people aren't getting the wrong idea about what we're saying here and what we are saying. So anyway, hopefully this will be at least, it'll be kind of a quick hitter, but it'll give you some tips and some thoughts to return to next time you're put in a situation where your vet is saying something to you and you're like, gosh, this just isn't, I don't agree with this, or this doesn't feel right to me, or I'm not sure about whether this is right. Give you a little bit of a framework to return to in your head so you can manage that situation as well as you can on behalf of your pet.
Yeah, this episode honestly was sparked by one of our listeners writing in. And I know that it's a topic that we've discussed previously, but really we haven't put it into a show form until now. So thank you all for continuing to write in. You can always reach out to us, Feed Your Dog Facts. And to start, let's go through the scenario. So I walk into my vet's office. I don't even necessarily deal with my veterinarian at first. I typically deal with the technician. And that's usually where I get asked, what food do you feed your dog? And then that information gets passed off to the veterinarian. Veterinarian comes in and, you eventually get to the topic of nutrition. What info should I be prepared to get reliable information on, not reliable information? Where do we even begin here?
Yeah, so I think that you're hitting exactly the first place to start here is can we say anything about where we would say the veterinarian is likely to give you accurate evidence-based information and where they're unlikely to do that. Can we say anything about that? And I think you kind of can. The reason that I think that is, there's kind of two different sources of like evidence that I think support the idea here. One is the body of experiences we've had around DCM. The nature of the like allegations that we've set forth in copious detail in the DCM lawsuit include, in essence, that vets are getting an issue wrong, that they're in a systematic, biased way saying something that is inaccurate about what the evidence actually shows. They're saying one thing when in reality, the evidence says something else. In that instance, what's going on there is they're getting an issue wrong. That's not me saying, disagreeing about what the future might hold. That's not a different interpretation of the evidence. This is in a very concrete way. They're saying A, but in reality, B is true. In this case, particularly in DCM, it is that there is a association that has been shown between higher rates of DCM among dogs fed a specific kind of diet. In reality, there is no evidence showing that. However, you hear that statement commonly from veterinarians. So in my judgment, it's totally fair to say that's something where they're wrong. There's a right and a wrong there. Has that association been shown or not? And as we explained in the lawsuit, they're on the side that's wrong, but it's common anyway to hold that belief. But it's not the only type of thing where I would say it's demonstrable that vets are getting something wrong. But on the other hand, any given veterinary professional on any given day is saying hundreds of things about the relevant body of evidence pertaining to companion animals. Only some of that has to do with nutritional topics. There are plenty of other things that you're talking to your veterinarian about. So are there things we can say about what kinds of topics your veterinarian is likely to get right, wrong, or raise suspicion over? What I would say is that when it comes to nutritional topics, the type of places where I think I have seen in my experience, veterinarians tend to get things wrong, say things that are inaccurate about the evidence, have beliefs that are not reflective of what the evidence actually shows, can generally be summarized in a particular kind of way, which is that if there is a possibility that a nutritional science issue can work in favor or against what you can think of as a garden variety, big kibble-focused pet food company, a company that makes garden variety kibble products, 40% carbohydrate, 20% protein, made in the United States, costs $60 for a large bag, very little moisture in it. That type of garden variety product, I think it is fair to say that veterinarians tend to get the answer on issues pertaining to those kinds of products wrong. That if there is a issue that is under some debate, if you're saying, geez, I wonder if that rings wrong to me, or I've got I heard somebody else tell me something that's different than what my veterinarian's saying, and it raises this possibility that there's some kind of conflict going on there. In my experience, it is the case that veterinarians tend to get those kinds of issues wrong when they pertain to those types of products, that they have often bad interpretations of what the evidence actually shows about the key nutritional subjects pertaining to those products. That's a very discrete, small universe of the total things you're going to talk to your veterinarian about. It would be a horrible idea, in my judgment, for you to go into a veterinary consultation and go, I am generally going to be skeptical about everything the veterinarian says, or I am going to assume that this person knows nothing, that they don't know the first thing about any of the subjects they're going to talk to me about because X, Y, and Z reason. And so I'm just going to always trust my own judgment about it. You're going to make bad decisions if that's the approach that you use. However, I also think you are going to make bad decisions if you don't treat a certain subset of information as more likely than not to be biased and then get things wrong. And it's the group of things within the domain of nutrition that pertain to the healthfulness of a garden variety kibble style product, a 40, 50% carbohydrate, 20% protein product made by a company that sells billions of dollars a year of the stuff at like $50 a bag.
That's so fascinating. I mean, I personally, when I visit my veterinarian, and just from somebody who's had a little bit more exposure, I think, than the average person into the veterinarian field, I was a vet tech for just a hot minute until I found out that behavior is actually where my passion lies. But when I go into a vet office, I ask myself, is this something I need to spend money on right now? And the reason I ask myself that is because oftentimes when you go into a vet visit, especially if it's not with a vet that you have established care with, and you're seeing this vet for the first time, oftentimes the more that they can put onto a bill, the more of a cut that they get from that. And so I constantly just check in with myself and ask, is this something that my dog needs, or is this something that can wait? Is this something I can get elsewhere for cheaper if I'm looking at, flea and tick prevention, those kind of things. And so really what I gathered from what you just said is checking in and asking, is there any benefit that my veterinarian gets out of this as well?
Well, yeah. So that is sort of the I was going to say a bit about like the why. When I say like, I think that it's fair, it's a good practice to be skeptical of veterinary claims about what the science shows surrounding this particular aspect of nutritional topics. The why behind that is in essence, I've done a huge amount of work. I spent a big chunk of my career on kind of one issue, which is how do veterinarians get taught about nutritional subjects? If they're going to tell you their belief about what the evidence says about something, it's coming from somewhere. What does that process look like? What are the textbooks that are used? What are the curricula that are used in veterinary schools? What are the programs all that? And in my experience, it's very fair and accurate to say that the kinds of companies about which I think misleading information gets put out there play a really large role in shaping that information in a systemic way. And so that information gets shaped in a biased way. They play such a significant role in shaping what it is that they have shaped what it is. And so that information gets passed on in kind of predictably, systematically biased and incorrect ways to veterinarians. And so I think that's sort of the why I think it's fair to say you tend to get bad information in that particular domain, although not generally. But then you're also highlighting a thing that's just being a good consumer of any product or service is like, right? You deal with the business, they're going to try on some level to a varying degree to kind of make good money off of you, sell you on relatively more of their products and services. Veterinarians no different than an airline or a, pet food company. They're going to try to and so approaching it with a perspective of like, can I separate what I need and what I want from what's being proposed here is always a pretty healthy practice in my judgment.
Yeah. No, that's a great reminder. And I think too, it's a good segue into our next point that we wanted to touch on, which is if veterinarians are taught this in school, obviously you're paying money to attend. And so you're assuming that the information that you're being taught is coming from a good faith place. And so when you go into your vet's office and perhaps they don't agree with you on feeding raw food, it's important to remember that there's a really good possibility you're probably not going to persuade your veterinarian that feeding a raw diet is better than feeding whatever they're recommending.
Absolutely. So that's point two. Point number one is like, I think it's fair to say there's a discrete universe of topics where you should be primed for the possibility that you're going to get bad information. And if you get something that feels like it doesn't ring true to you, you might want to be inclined to listen to your gut on that. And then the second point that I think is a really fair one to take into these kind of situations is the reminder that this is not a domain for one party to persuade the other party. Like at least it's not a domain for you to try to persuade your veterinarian about something. The analogy I'd make here is like, I recently went to dinner with people that are on the other side of the political aisle from where I am. Politics don't play a big part in my life, but I do kind of have a political identity where I vote in predictable ways. Same with the people that I was at dinner with. but they're on sort of the other side of that political aisle. And you go, I'm sure anyone that's listening to this has had that kind of conversation in their life, right? Like you're interacting with people that either are much more into their political identity than you are, or they're just on a different side of issues. The golden rule when it comes to that stuff, and it's a rule that I've violated at this particular dinner, the golden rule is don't go into that stuff with people in those kind of situations. Nobody's going to persuade anybody else. You're going to fight and fight and fight, and nobody is going to change their perspective because both sides are going to think, well, the other side is getting their information from the wrong place. They're all wrong in this kind of way. They're all, flawed in this kind of way, both sides. And nobody comes away. You end up angry. You lose a lot over the interaction you're having, and nobody comes away persuaded. I would encourage you to think about debate over nutritional science topics with veterinarians the same way. It is certainly the way that in my everyday life of getting care for my dogs, that is how I approach it. It's like you might hear something that you either disagree with or suspect is incorrect in the course of a veterinary visit. You have a million ways that you can proceed from there. Okay, I identified that there's somebody saying something that I don't agree with. You do not have to. And I would encourage you not to try to get into a debate over who is right about this. Primarily because no matter how good your reasoning is and the folks on the other side's reasoning is, you are not going to persuade them. That is like, it is going to happen in some very rare instances, but it's uncommon enough that I would encourage you not to bear the costs that are going to come along with trying to do that. Just remember that that is not a necessary thing in getting care for your dog. Persuading your veterinarian is not something that you need to do in that way. They're going to tell you what they think, and you can do any number of things with that. But I would strongly encourage folks not to waste their time, as it were, trying to persuade in that environment. It's not realistic target. Folks have been trained up as professionals. As a client, you're in there in a posture of not being a professional. The bar that you have to clear in order to be persuasive there in the best of circumstances is unrealistically high. You're not going to be conversant enough to overcome their existing beliefs with the relevant material. It's just not realistic. It's saying, in essence, I read something that is different. You're going to have to, in order to be persuasive, you're going to have to be able to say much more than that. That's never going to cut it. And so you're going to have an instinct to just like all of us have when you get in one of these political conversations, to articulate your side of it and say, no, I think you're wrong. But it's not worth your time. And I would strongly encourage you to proceed through that situation and get the right kind of care and get to the right kind of outcome you want without trying to persuade them that they're wrong about something.
Yeah, I think your good point there too is that you are seeking out the care and help of a professional. And so I think it's a good reminder too, going into just our third point, which is remember what your veterinarian's role is, and also remember what your role is as well.
Yeah. So, and that's kind of this third point that I'd say is it's sort of similar to the second one of just don't try to persuade anybody, is to take a breath and remember what your role is there and what their role is there. That you're going to this person that is an expert in this particular domain so that they can tell you what, in their expert opinion, you ought to do about some specific things. And if you're into it, to do some specific things in light of that information, to take some procedure, prescribe some medication, make some sort of dietary change. It is never the case that the veterinarian is taking on custody or, guardianship of the animal that you're talking about. That is your role. You are the person that is the guardian, custodian, owner, life partner, whatever you want to call it for that animal. The veterinarian is there to give you their insight as a professional and as a bona fide expert about how to do that role well. But at the end of the day, that's not they're not the guardian for that animal. There might be some, technical situations in which a vet is in that situation. If an animal gets dropped off there, person is exhibiting some sort of, erratic behavior, maybe. But in the most cases, you're in there going talking to the vet because you're the guardian, you're the decision maker, you're in charge of that animal. They're there to help you make the best decisions you can about that. And I think that remembering that, taking a beat to remember that the situation here is not the veterinarian is making decisions about how to care for that animal. The situation is the veterinarian is telling you what they think the decisions you should make are. And those are two different things. And it can be helpful to remind yourself of that in this kind of domain because it changes sort of the pressure framework. Like it's easy to be like, I felt like I had to do X, Y, or Z because my veterinarian told me that they recommend X, Y, or Z. And there are reasons, I'm not by any stretch saying that like you should reject your veterinarian's recommendations. That's ridiculous. But it's not the case that because they recommend it, you must do it. You are in a place where you are in charge of the animal. You're making those calls.
Yeah, I mean, just from a dog training perspective, one of the big things that I was always taught and that I also teach my clients is to advocate for your dog. And so if you have a dog that might not be the friendliest with strangers and you are passing people on the street, it's super important to advocate for what your dog is comfortable with and what they aren't. So for example, not allowing strangers to pet your dog. That doesn't appreciate affection from strangers. And so in this circumstance, I think it's really cool to just remind everyone that you are advocating for your dog and what you think is best for your dog. And we are here to advocate for you and say that take it all in. But at the end of the day, don't forget the role that you play in your dog's life too. And then I think bringing it back to just remembering roles is, to your political analogy and point, if you've ever written a letter into, your local or to your local congressman or, really anyone who you're trying to persuade on an issue, you never go into it and say, well, my taxpayer dollars are the reason that you're here, therefore you should support XYZ. You go into it with a very appreciative and thankful tone. And I think it's just important to also treat your veterinarians with that respect as well.
Totally good point. It's like, that's a part of the, that's the downside, the cost of trying to persuade is like you engage in a conversation like that, real things that are maybe not the things you want are going to start to happen in that relationship. You're not going to get some of the things that you're hoping to get out of that because you're going to be poisoning, by virtue of being in opposition to somebody, the nature of the relationship. You're going to get veterinarian feels some degree of pressure about something they feel like they shouldn't be subjected to pressure on. It's going to change the nature of the service they're providing to you. You know what I mean? Like that's human nature, even if they're trying their best not to. And so that's totally right. The downside, the reason you ought not try to persuade is not just because you're unlikely to be persuasive, but because real things get lost if you try to do that. You really are going to damage the nature of that relationship in a way that could hurt your dog. So, totally good point.
And so I am in a discussion with my veterinarian. They have asked me what food I feed. I have said, whatever diet. They have said, I really think that it's a good idea for you to switch. Here are a couple different options. They've, sent me a list of foods that I should consider. But at the end of the day, I just don't think that what they're recommending is accurate or the best, or, maybe there's a specific point that they're making. What do I do? How do I navigate this as far as next steps?
Yeah. So what I would say is that when you get into a conversation like that and you've remembered the first three things we've talked about. So your vet has said something that is within the domain of nutrition. It is about one of these topics that I mentioned in the first point that there often is bad information about. You've remembered, I'm not going to try to persuade this person. You've remembered that I'm the caregiver for this animal and they're the expert that's helping me do that. And they're saying something specific. What do you do then? Well, it might be the case that you have no reason to feel any degree of doubt, suspicion, bias, uncertainty regarding it. And to return again to the first point, I'm only suggesting that generally that comments and ideas and beliefs and recommendations within one very discrete group of topics should at all raise bias. But before you get into specific things, but like generally speaking, the vast majority of the things your veterinarian is going to say to you is not going to fall into that group. And you're not going to feel any degree of, I disagree with that. I have some reason to disagree with this person about this. So it doesn't really raise the issue, the framing that you're talking about. But sometimes it is, right? Sometimes somebody's going to say something to you. Maybe you agree with me that anytime it's a nutritional topic that touches on sort of the garden variety big kibble things that I highlighted at the beginning of this, that's enough for you to become suspicious of whether they're right. Maybe for you, that's enough to assume that they're not right about something. Those are two discrete places to be, right? Like you can be in a place where you're like, they've said something to me and I think they're wrong. Or you can be in a place where it's like, they said something to me and I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether I should trust it or not. Two different ways to proceed, depending on which of those two groups you fall into. Let's say that they say something to you and it rises to the level of, I don't agree with that. Like I've learned through whatever experience I've had that what they're saying, I don't believe is true. Then the course of action I would suggest to you is if you feel confident about that, they haven't persuaded you. If they've said something, if you're open to the possibility, if you don't feel certain about your beliefs, you feel uncertain about them, then what you're doing is you're having a conversation where they're trying to persuade you to agree with them. And so you're asking them for the things that would be persuasive if they had them. So you would say, I would submit, you would say something like, I'm not sure about that, or what is the data? Can you give me the data you have that shows that or supports that? Give me something to be persuaded by. And I'm not doing a very artful job here of like teeing it up in the most relationship friendly way, but there is, if you're a more artful person than me, a very relationship friendly way to do that. Veterinarian says something to you, you're doubtful but not rock solid certain that they're wrong about it. What kind of comment can you make by way of response? If you're open to being persuaded, is like, okay, can you send me something that'll help me understand that issue better? Can you give me something? Can you show me the actual data? It's like, I keep straying into what feels more provocative. And I feel like there is a gentler way to put it out there where you don't have to actively imply, I disagree with you, but you can instead imply, I'm somebody that's expressing a healthy responsibility for my dog, and I just want to make sure I'm always looking at the initial evidence to make sure I follow that. And so that's sort of where I'm going with this. Whether I'm saying it the right way is certainly up for debate, but asking for, if you're suspicious, asking for the data, or evidence that supports the point that they're trying to make. Because that ought to be what is persuasive to you. And so then if they can bring that kind of thing to you, you do feel persuaded by it, great. Everybody's on the same page and we can move forward with a treatment plan.
Yeah. And then again, just an emphasis on what you are looking for, because oftentimes there are blog posts that live in a mass library on your veterinarian's computer. And oftentimes if you have questions about nutrition, or let's say like something like spay and neuter, they pull from a database that is more bloggy than it is factual. So I would say that emphasis on making sure that you're asking for specific studies and data points, not blogs.
That's why I'm really trying to emphasize the words data and evidence, is because that's a good, there is a broader category of stuff that is used to justify beliefs, that much of which feels very professional, like credible. It has the right organization's seal on it. It comes from the right place. And if you're not being a little bit thoughtful about what it is and what it isn't, it can include things that are not evidence and that are not data. And so
send them home with the handout.
Exactly. And what's the you got to do a little bit of reading comprehension with regards to the handout. They provide you a handout that says, I don't know, that's about the topic of spay and neuter. And it says that, in a 2022 study of 100 dogs, those that were neutered before 4 months old had X incidence rate of X problem. That's a data thing. That's an evidence thing. If they say in a generalized way, we recommend neutering before months because of cancer risk or something like that, that's not an evidence-based thing. That doesn't allow you as the reader to go pull to verify the accuracy of that in a simple way. Like if there's numbers in there, you can pull those numbers yourself if you're so inclined and run them down. And so I'd encourage you to use the words data and evidence to make sure, and then make sure that what's provided is that, and whether or not you're going to get in a dispute about it, remember it for yourself as to what you've said is going to be persuasive to you. Data and evidence are persuasive to you, and you get a bloggy handout that doesn't include those things, it shouldn't be persuasive to you. If it includes the data and evidence that you're looking for, then per your own logic, it should.
And this is where it can be so tough to be a pet consumer did I say that right? A pet consumer?
A food consumer or like a pet owner? Yeah, I mean...
A pet owner is where my brain was going. It's why it's so difficult to be a pet owner is because let's say I'm given a study and let's say it is on spay and neuter. If the study date is from 2020, that's 4 years ago. Things might have very well changed. So I think
yeah. It's inescapable. There's a million ways. Like the problem of you have folks that we ought to be able to look to for reliable information about discrete topics. Often and in systematic ways are getting that information wrong. What do you do about that? Well, it's a tough nut to crack, it turns out, and it's a long-term thing. But the one thing that I always return to that's unfortunate, it's not the answer a lot of people want to hear, but it just is the state of things. There's not a better answer than this. It's like you do need to have some degree of scientific literacy. You do need to be able to look at the evidence that's provided to you and determine whether or not it really supports the point that it's being provided for. That's not a exercise a child can do. That's a thing that a lot of adults can't do. And various adults do it to varying degrees of success. And developing your literacy around those concepts is unfortunately in this domain the only really reliable way to make sure you're making good decisions. Like I wish it was simple enough to say, always trust this person and never trust this person, or use these 4 rules and they're going to help you learn who to trust. It doesn't work that way. Unfortunately, that's not how it is right now. And it's tough because I wish it was, but yep, it's part of it. And so that skill set is exactly what you're describing, is that like when you're provided with some justification, can you look at that? How much are you able to look at that and figure out whether it is something that supports or doesn't support the point that it's being provided for?
So just a recap of our 4 points here. When you go into your veterinary's office, remember what might you get unreliable information on. Then think, okay, I'm not going to persuade anybody. That's okay. Next, remember what your role is, what your veterinarian's role is. Respect their role as well. And then our 4th point, if you get into a discussion about a specific topic, if you're concerned about accuracy, ask for the data.
And then the 5th and final thing that I'll put out there is just because we have so much exposure to DCM directly, and it's such a pervasive issue generally these days, that on that topic specifically, we get asked about how to deal with veterinary discussions around that enough that it probably warrants like a few words of just direct discussion about. So like you go into your vet, they ask you what you feed your dog, tell them what you feed your dog. You have discussion about whatever you've brought the animal in for. And then they say, and by the way, did you know that we don't recommend that you feed that kind of food because studies have shown that those kinds of dogs or those kinds of foods raise the risk of DCM, or you should be concerned about this very serious disease, DCM. What do you do then? You are, remember the previous 4 rules that are suggestions that we put forth going into that. Number 1, this is squarely something that falls into the bucket, the realm that I would submit should raise concerns going into it, even regardless of what you know about the issue. It's about something that clearly has an impact on how much traditional large kibble products are sold, number 1. Number 2, remember, you're not going to persuade the veterinarian. There's no chance that you are going to be so conversant on the relevant material on DCM that you're going to leave that conversation having persuaded the veterinarian. Number 3, remember that it's not their role to make decisions for your dog. It's your role to do that. They are there to give you their advice about it. You're there to determine what advice to take. Which brings you to number 4. They say that you can ask, can you send me the data and evidence that's based upon so I can look at it and we can talk about it next time. Great place to end the conversation there. If you want to go further than that, if you feel that, it's like DCM does enjoy this sort of privileged status these days in veterinary conversations, where it is this very specific thing that veterinarians are getting wrong in a very specific way, in a very systematic, predictable way. If you want to go one step further, the thing I would recommend saying is they recommend DCM for a particular food product for concerns over DCM. I would suggest you say, I have heard that the FDA has stopped that investigation and that some big pet food company got sued over it. And take the conversation from there. They might react to both of those 2 things. They might say, well, the FDA, they ended their investigation, but for X, Y, and Z reason, it's still significant to me. But putting the lawsuit out there is a good way to sort of gauge the level of knowledge that person is bringing to the conversation. Like if you point out, well, I heard that the big pet food company got sued over this, and they go, I've never heard that. You can infer that the relevant substance that like you're going to be making your determination of whether or not there's good evidence supporting a DCM-based like logic, they're not familiar with the relevant material. They've got a very facial level, surface level understanding of the issues. If you are serious about trying to understand this issue, you have to recognize to some degree it's a disputed thing, that there's factions of folks who believe different things, and you have to be serious enough about dealing with high profile, big time lawsuits and understanding what they say and don't say in order to develop an informed opinion about it. And so if somebody says like, no, I'm not familiar with that at all, in my judgment, should be significant in some ways. On the other hand, if they say, oh yeah, I did hear that, asking like them to sort of rebut, like explain, okay, well, you've heard about that. So why is it that you still are recommending this to me? And judging that answer, I think is a really good way to go about determining whether to take their advice or not. If they can say to you, yeah, I read that, I understood about what they're saying there, but I think it's wrong for X, Y, and Z reason, great. That's a persuasive-ish thing to say. I'm not sure what they would say, but that's persuasive. If they say, no, I've not heard of that, or yeah, I heard of that, but I think I think they're going to lose, and that's kind of all they can say about it, that's not very persuasive in my judgment. And so those are sort of like a few DCM specific things that maybe in the very minority of cases you might want to go into specifically.
Can I tell you what I do?
Yeah, please.
I give them your information.
Yeah, that's always fun. It's not going to persuade. Like it's
No, but it's a nice I think after I've made the point that I thank you for recommending these other alternative foods. I am very happy with what I have my dog on. Well, just be careful because of DCM. Okay, have you read about the case? Do you know what's going on? And I think my veterinarian continues to, this is, happened the first time that I went in, but continues to try to persuade me they're not following our second suggestion. Then I have pulled out and said, here is the contact information of Daniel Schulof, who is the founder and CEO of Keto Natural Pet Foods, and who can answer any follow-up questions you have. And I've also recommended that to
I have no problem with that. I welcome that. I like having those conversations. They could be hard to come by, but yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah. So if you're looking for, I don't know, an alternative,
it's like when I am in a vet's office, sometimes I'll get that, and for me, I honor the rules that we've tried to kind of come to through this. And it's like, I don't have that conversation, not because I don't think in a good faith, protracted discussion, I would ultimately persuade that person. I do believe that in 9 out of 10 cases, that given the right amount of time and attention, I would persuade that person to change their opinion about DCM. I think there are kind of unrealistic circumstances that are baked into that, though. It's like you're in an office environment, not in front of a bunch of studies with papers right there. Everybody's on the clock. They're trying to churn and burn. They're running a business. They don't have an hour to sit down with you and figure it out. It's going to take that amount of time. And so it's just like, I don't even say, oh, well, I'm a guy. I actually filed this lawsuit. I did all this work about, it's like, nope.
Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah. And it's, I don't know if, I'd be interested to see if any vets do actually follow up with you. I'm doubtful over that.
Yeah, it's not something that happens commonly.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I feel like even though it was a little bit of a different podcast episode, hopefully that is helpful for all of our listeners and viewers at home. If you have any follow-up questions or suggestions on what you'd like to hear for our next episodes, please reach out to us. We love to hear from you. And again, thank you to one of our listeners who wrote in, who was the inspiration for this episode. So with that, I will leave you all. Daniel, again, thank you so much. And we will see you guys soon.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Take care.